Hey everyone, in this lesson we are going to be going over the protagonist, okay? In storytelling, in movies, in books, in games, pretty much every single storytelling narrative has a protagonist. So, first of all, who is the protagonist? Well, basically the protagonist is the main character of the story, and in video games, you normally play as the protagonist, okay? So the character you're controlling in a game is the protagonist, is the main character who is going through the story. Now, the more story-focused a game is, generally the more defined the protagonist will be, okay? You'll notice that in a game that's, not really story-focused at all, such as Minecraft, you don't really know a lot about the protagonist. You don't really know a lot about the player, as it's set up that way. If there was a predefined history with the player in Minecraft, it would seem kind of odd. Rather, it leaves it open to your imagination to pretty much play the game how you'd like and make your own stories along the way. Then you got something like Halo, which has a bit of background on the character. You have some motives, but it's of course not a fully fleshed out character because the story, although it is part of the game, it isn't the core focus of the game. Yet we go on the other side of the spectrum, which have a large story focus, such as Life is Strange, which is basically a narrative game. The characters and the protagonists in that game are very fleshed out, okay? Even up to the point where we have full-on character arcs for the protagonist, okay? So you can see the sort of spectrum along video games on how important the protagonist is and how defined they are based on how story-focused the game is, okay? Now, let's look at games with no story focus and how they utilize the protagonist. So in games with no story focus, there is generally no protagonist, okay? Only the player. When we say protagonist, we generally mean an actual character with a name, with some background, and with some conflicts and wants and needs, okay? But in games like Minecraft and No Man's Sky, there is no protagonist. There is only you, the player, and you yourself define the goals, define the challenges, define the wants, the needs of your player. Okay, there are no story-focused conflicts, goals, or character building for the player in these games. And in many cases, the game is a foundation for you to create your own stories, okay? Sandbox games, creative games, the sort of games where the gameplay isn't directly defined by the developer, rather it's left open for you to explore and go about it at your own pace. And some examples are Minecraft, No Man's Sky, and online competitive games. So, next up we have moderate story-focused games, okay? This is where the protagonist serves as a tool or driving force for the story, rather than the focus, okay? So the gameplay, the action, what you'll be playing as a player is more important than the story itself, but the story is there to serve as a foundation for guiding the gameplay. Okay, the protagonist may have goals such as saving the world or stopping the villain, but they'll generally have no development or change across the game. Okay, they'll pretty much stay the exact same, but they will still have, some motives to accomplish the goal. And some examples are Halo, Doom, the Mario games, and pretty much most video games would actually fit into this category. Because at the end of the day, video games are an interactive medium, okay? The main focus of video games is, I'd say, to have fun and to play these games. So story isn't necessarily the most important factor in games, but if games do have an important story and good gameplay, that is generally where they shine. Okay, so next up, let's look at large story-focused games. These are games where story and the narrative is generally the focus point, and the actual gameplay is, not necessarily unique, and it can be quite generic or limiting because the developers are trying to have you focused on the story. Okay, and this is of course where the story is focused on the protagonist. The protagonist is the center of the conflict, the center of the world in these sort of games, and they have goals, conflicts, and change throughout the story. Okay, if you watch movies with good character development, you'll notice that your characters change across the story. Okay, the same goes for these sort of games. Some examples would be Life is Strange, Firewatch, and the Telltale games, okay? If you've played any of these games, you'll know that these are heavily narrative-based games where there'll be a lot of dialogue, a lot of story, and they'll generally be quite linear. There won't be much room for you to move around and sort of go off the beaten track or go along and make your own stories, okay? Because these games are trying to tell you a specific story, and you're along for the ride. So, next up, we need to go over the protagonist goals. Now, the protagonist goals are there to create an enticing protagonist, okay? They have to want something. And this should tie into the game plot and relate to the gameplay, okay? For example, saving the world, becoming rich, defeating the villain, etc. Okay? If you want a good, well-defined protagonist, they have to want something. And the game is going to be their journey of trying to achieve it. For example, in Firewatch, the goal of the protagonist is to uncover the mysterious events happening around him. In Far Cry 3, it's to rescue his friends and become a warrior. In Red Dead Redemption 2, it's to take care and protect his team from the outside world, okay? And many story-focused games, you can find what the protagonist wants and how the game utilizes its gameplay in order for you to achieve that. Next up, we have Protagonist Dialogue. Now, in lots of story-focused games and not story-focused games, the protagonist is either spoken or silent, okay? So we have a spoken protagonist, which of course means a dialogue being spoken, you can hear it through your headphones, or silent, where generally they won't say anything at all, or it will just be a short phrase that you can pick and it will be text-based. Now, this is a conscious decision made by developers based on the story and the importance of the protagonist, okay? Now, protagonists with goals, conflicts, and the potential to change are generally voiced, okay? So you have a voice actor come in and record the lines, and it will give them a specific emotion, a specific voice behind that character, okay? What this does is it makes the character feel more real, and voice acting can emphasize emotion, need, and personality, okay? And all the things you want in a fleshed out protagonist. So games like Call of Duty, for example, the campaigns have voiced actors because these are characters who are predefined. You know, they're not up to your imagination on what you want to make them. They are predefined characters with goals, motives, and progression through the story. Same thing with a lot of the Telltale games such as The Walking Dead. Everyone is voice acted because all these characters are important and all these characters serve a specific point to the story. And of course, you, the protagonist. Now we have the silent protagonist, and this is normally used in games with less of a story focus, okay? They might go for a silent protagonist, especially in RPGs where you are the character, okay? And they generally don't have voice acting at all for you. They may for other characters because those are well-defined characters with goals and needs and wants, but you yourself, you're generally a blank slate, okay? They allow you to develop your character. They allow you to choose what avenues you want to go down. And if they did have a voice actor for you in an RPG, then seeing yourself in that character would be less immersive and limiting. Now, if we're speaking of RPGs and silent protagonists or voice protagonists, then we want to have a look at an example where we actually have a voice protagonist in an RPG, okay? Most RPGs have a silent protagonist, but in Cyberpunk 2077, you actually have a voice, okay? You can either be a male or a female voice in the game. So why did the developers do this? Well, this is because although it's still an RPG, the focus of the story is on you and your journey, okay? You can choose how you go about doing stuff, but at the end of the day, the story of the game is focused directly on you and your conflicts, okay? Generally, in other RPGs, the conflict is either a villain or some other conflict in the world that the player has to solve, rather than the conflict being themselves. Now, as a bit of a challenge, I want you to think of a story-heavy game that you've played or know about, and think of these three things, okay? Well, first of all, what did the protagonist want? What was their goal? What was their objective during the game? Secondly, what prevented the protagonist from getting it? Was there some sort of villain in the way? Was there some sort of obstacle that they had to overcome throughout the progression of the game in order to achieve their goal? And finally, how did the protagonist change throughout the game? Okay, how were they at the start of the game and how were they at the end of the game? And how did they change from being one type of person to another? Were they an angry person at the start and a peaceful person at the end? What was that sort of character arc progression? So have a go at that, and thank you for watching. Hey everyone, in this lesson we are going to be looking at the antagonist. Now, unlike the protagonist, the antagonist is the opposing force of the narrative. A lot of the time they'll be the one that starts the conflict, and the aim of the game or the aim of the story is to defeat the antagonist, okay, the villain of the story. So, first of all, who is the antagonist? Well, they are the villain or opposing force in the story, okay? The protagonist is trying to defeat, stop, or find the antagonist, and there are examples of this in pretty much every game. A lot of games do have an antagonist, and generally at the end of the game, that is where you'll have your final boss battle with them. And they are normally the cause of the game's main conflict, okay? That maybe they're trying to end the world, maybe they're trying to do something evil, and it's up to the protagonist to save the day. Now, it's important to establish your antagonist in your game, okay? So, if your game has an antagonist, they need to be established. You need to introduce them to the world and initiate the conflict, okay? The player needs to be known of the antagonist's presence, and many games establish their antagonist at the very start of the game, okay? You'll notice many games, such as Skyrim for example, at the very start of the game, even before you're able to control your character, Skyrim's main antagonist attacks the town you're in and burns it to the ground, okay? And that initiates the conflict of dragons are back and they are a danger to the world. Another good example is the Far Cry games. You can take pretty much any Far Cry game and they all follow the same formula of introducing the antagonist right at the start of the game, okay? Far Cry 5, for example, at the start of the game, you and your team go to arrest the antagonist, who you're introduced to, but he escapes and captures your team members, and this creates the conflict of your team members are being held hostage, and you of course need to save them, and that is when the game plays out. Same thing goes for Far Cry 4 and Far Cry 3, the main start of the game where you're pretty much in a cutscene watching the players, or not being able to control the player. That is where they are introducing the antagonist, and you'll notice in a wide range of other games as well. Sometimes even before you can play the game, the antagonist is being introduced to you. And the lack of being able to control yourself or control the situation means that the developers are trying to show you, the player, the antagonist so that you have an idea of why you are doing the things you are doing in the game. Okay? And throughout the game, you also want to reinforce the antagonist, okay? So from the initial establishment of the antagonist to the confrontation at the end of the game, you want to further reinforce them throughout the game, okay? This can be a wide range of different things, and it depends on who they are, how much power they have, and what they want to do. Okay, let's take Far Cry 5 for example. If you've played Far Cry 5 before, you will know that the antagonist's presence is seen all throughout the game. There is a massive statue of the antagonist in the game that you can go and destroy, and that is just there to show you that they are basically controlling of the world around you, and wherever you go you see hints of the antagonist. You can hear him on the radio, you can of course see the statue, you can see all of his army talking about him, and the whole world sort of revolves around the antagonist and is there to establish and reinforce them and what they are trying to do. Now, another concept we should go over is the antihero. Now, some games have you play as a protagonist who isn't all that good. You're not necessarily the antagonist, but you're not a good hero either, okay? And this is known as the antihero. You'll see this in movies as well. Many movies have an antihero main character. And this is basically someone who's the main character, yet they lack heroic attributes. They may be greedy, they may kill people, they may do illegal things, but in the end, they're doing it for good reasons. Okay, some examples are the Grand Theft Auto games, Infamous, the Saints Row games, and the Hitman games. Okay, there are actually quite a wide range of games that do have an anti-hero. Also, some things to note is make sure that your anti-hero is likable, because the thing with making an anti-hero is that unlike making a protagonist, which comparatively is quite easy, okay? A protagonist, they have heroic attributes, they are basically the hero of the story. Whereas the anti-hero needs to be both bad yet likable, and the balance between those two can be quite difficult, okay? You need your anti-hero to do things that generally outside people would see as bad or evil, yet from your perspective as playing with them or as being around them and hearing their story, it needs to be positive, okay? They should view their actions as a necessary means in order to reach a positive outcome, okay? So they should be doing things that may not necessarily be good, but they are doing it for a specific reason. So, as a bit of a challenge, I want you to think of a game that you have played or that you know of and think of who was the antagonist, okay? And I want you to basically think of these three things. First of all, how was the antagonist established, okay? How were they introduced to both you and the player in the game? And what conflict did they cause? What is the main issue of the game that you as a player need to solve? And does that revolve around the antagonist? And finally, how was their presence reinforced throughout the game? Okay, most games will have an establishment of the antagonist, and then at the end of the game, they will have sort of the final stand or the final battle of the antagonist to defeat them. But between that start of the game and the end of the game, how was this antagonist reestablished? How were their motives? How was their plans basically laid out to the player? You know, how did the player know constantly throughout the game that the antagonist is still a presence in the game world? Okay, so have a go at that, and thank you for watching.